When you watch a skyscraper being constructed,
Yeah.
there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah.
You lay the steel framework, the concrete cures to a specific PSI, and the blueprints are followed to the letter.
It is very calculated.
Yeah, and the structural engineer can just point at the finished product and say, there it is, the mass works, it will stand. You can calculate the wind shear, the load-bearing capacity, the stress points. It is basically a closed system.
It is binary, really. I mean, the math either works or it fails. And human beings, well, we love that. We crave closed systems because they are clean.
Oh, for sure.
They are visible. We can categorize all the variables and keep them strictly within our own control.
But then you step away from the construction site and you get into the reality of daily life.
That is a whole different story.
It really is. You try raising a toddler or keeping a small business afloat or, managing a team of unpredictable human beings,
Right.
and suddenly that reliable mathematics is just completely shattered.
Yeah, the variables are everywhere.
Right. You are looking at a landscape of human effort that is messy, chaotic, and entirely out of your control. You're listening to Reformed Thinking. If you are someone who works tirelessly, pouring your absolute maximum effort into your career or your home, yet you are kept awake at night by this quiet, gnawing anxiety that it might all fall apart anyway, well, this discussion is targeted directly at you.
It is a heavy burden to carry.
It is. Today, we are doing a deep dive into an extensive commentary from Charles Spurgeon's The Treasury of David. We are specifically unpacking Psalm 127.
Which is a brilliant text for this.
Yeah, our mission here is to examine the tension between human effort and divine sovereignty. I mean, how do you grind? How do you put in the hours without falling into the agonizing trap of self-reliance?
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the historical background of this specific text is absolute best place to start. It sets up this massive irony right out of the gate.
How so?
Well, the title of this text is A Song of Degrees for Solomon. It was written by David, the warrior king, for his son. Now, Solomon had another name given to him at birth by the prophet Nathan.
Right, Jedediah.
Spot on. Jedediah! And that name translates to beloved of the Lord. The spirit of that specific name, that identity of being the beloved, it breathes through the entire text we are looking at today. But here is the paradox we have to confront immediately. Solomon was the most ambitious builder in the history of the ancient Near East.
I mean, he built everything.
He really did.
The grand temple, his own massive sprawling palace that took over a decade to construct, entirely new fortified cities, aqueducts, massive public works projects. The sheer scale of his architectural ambition was just staggering.
It was unparalleled. He imported cedar from Lebanon. He conscripted tens of thousands of laborers. He had endless supplies of gold and bronze. He was the ultimate master builder. Yet, this text, written specifically for him, the greatest builder in Israel's history, is an extended, blunt warning against relying on his own building skills. It is telling the man with the most resources on earth that his resources are useless on their own.
That is such a fascinating tension. The guy with the ultimate blueprint is basically being told his blueprint is a blank piece of paper if he relies on his own intellect.
That is a great way to put it.
And that brings us right to the famous opening decree of the text. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. The word vain rings out 3 distinct times in just the opening lines.
Yeah, the repetition of that word is highly deliberate. The concept of vanity in this ancient context doesn't mean, being obsessed with your looks in a mirror.
Right. Not that kind of vanity.
No, it means emptiness, futility, a vapor that vanishes the moment you try to grab it. When people set out to build something, whether it is a physical house or a corporate empire, they know they have to work hard. They put forth all their skill, all their physical strength, all their capital.
But the text establishes a hard boundary line there.
It does. If the Lord is not the primary actor, the primary builder, the design will prove to be a total failure. The commentator, Wolfgang Musculus, makes a brilliant linguistic observation here. He notes that the text does not say, unless the Lord consents that the house should be built.
Wait, unpack the difference there. Consenting versus building.
Well, if God consents, it means he is just a passive observer stamping a permit.
Oh, I see.
It means you do all the heavy lifting, you design the architecture, you swing the hammer, and God just nods from a distance and says, sure, you have my permission to succeed.
Like a building inspector signing off.
Right. But the text says, unless the Lord builds. That requires the active, ongoing, operational working of God in the project itself. Without that active participation from the divine, all human strength, care, and industry are futile vapors.
I have to push back here for a second,
Go for it.
because this interpretation immediately raises a massive red flag for a lot of people. If God has to be the active builder, why should I do anything? Does this mean human effort is entirely useless?
That is the logical next question.
Because we hear these modern cultural cliches all the time, things like let go and let God. If I am stressed about my startup failing or my kid failing algebra, is this ancient text telling me to just step back, take my hands off the wheel, and assume a posture of total passivity?
That is the most common and honestly the most dangerous misunderstanding of this concept. The text is absolutely not advocating for passivity.
Okay, so what is it saying?
Look closely at the phrasing. It says they labor in vain that build it. It assumes the builder is on the scaffolding, actively sweating and building. It says the watchman waketh, but in vain. It assumes the guard is actively pacing the stone walls, keeping his eyes peeled for enemy movement in the dark. The Holy Spirit is not the patron of laziness.
So the command is not to drop the hammer.
Not at all. The command is to recognize the difference between primary and secondary causes. Human beings are secondary causes. We must utilize the trowel, the hammer, the saw, the spreadsheet, the marketing plan.
Right.
We are required to be wakeful, vigilant guards over our families and our communities. We are commanded to work and to work diligently. The boundary line is not about stopping our labor. It is a strict prohibition against placing our absolute trust in the labor we have performed. You swing the hammer, but you do not worship the hammer. You do not believe the hammer is the source of your security.
You know, this reminds me of that legendary order Oliver Cromwell gave to his troops during the English Civil War. They were about to cross a river to engage the enemy, and he told them, trust in God and keep your powder dry.
Oh, that is the perfect historical synthesis of this entire concept.
It really paints a picture.
It does. Think about the mechanics of a 17th century musket. If the gunpowder gets wet, the chemical reaction cannot occur. The gun is useless. It becomes nothing more than a heavy club.
Right.
Keeping the powder dry requires human vigilance. You have to protect your pouch from the rain. You have to manage your equipment. You have to do your part. But Cromwell understood that dry powder alone does not dictate the outcome of a battle.
A stray bullet, a shift in the wind, a tactical error, 1,000 variables are outside the soldier's control.
Yes. The dry powder will not win the victory without divine providence, but keeping it dry is still a non-negotiable requirement.
You cannot just leave your powder in a puddle and say, well, God will win the battle if he wants to.
That would be presumptuous and foolish. Happy is the person who hits the golden mean. You work so diligently as to believe in God's providence, and you believe in God's providence so thoroughly that you can work without crippling fear.
So we have this tension. We must work, but we cannot rely on the work itself.
Correct.
Let's ground this in some historical realities, because our source material gives us some vivid contrasts between self-reliant building and God-blessed building. The most famous contrast in the text is between the builders of Babel and the building of Solomon's temple.
Babel is the ultimate archetype of laboring in sheer defiance of God. Look at their stated motivation. Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name.
It was all about them.
Entirely. It was an enterprise fueled by human ego and the desire for absolute autonomy. They relied on their own engineering, their own ambitions, and their own unity.
And the outcome was total systemic collapse. The linguistics were confounded, the communication broke down, and the project was abandoned.
It was a disaster.
They toiled in vain because their foundation was entirely self-centric. They were fighting against the grain of divine providence.
Now look at the contrast with Solomon's temple. When Solomon resolved to build, he recognized it was a task given to him by God. And because the providence aligned, the text notes how all things united to aid him.
Even foreign kings helped out, right?
Yes, even earthly kings from pagan nations, like Hiram of Tyre, willingly sent materials and skilled artisans to aid the construction. The massive stones were hewn and shaped at the quarry so that no sound of a hammer or iron tool was even heard at the building site.
That is wild to think about.
It was an undertaking of staggering scale. Yet it succeeded smoothly because the true master builder was orchestrating the variables Solomon could never control.
The commentary we are studying points out how many massive palaces and great houses have been erected by ambitious individuals throughout history, only to pass away like a vision.
It happens all the time.
It specifically mentions the Nonsuch Palace. This was a massive, opulent estate built by Henry VIII in England. It was designed to be the ultimate flex of royal wealth and power, completely unrivaled. And the commentator notes that if the original builder could return to the site today, he would be bewildered to find scarcely a single stone remaining.
Wow.
All that toil, all that wealth, all that anxiety melted away like the froth of vanity.
Because physical bricks and mortar, no matter how securely laid, are subject to time, decay, and shifting political winds. Albert Barnes, one of the scholars cited in our material, points out the unpredictable nature of these variables. You can hire the best watchmen, build the highest walls, and establish the tightest security protocols, but a fire can break out from a single spark.
Yeah, or a hurricane sweeps over the coastline.
Or a microscopic pestilence can shut down a city overnight. You simply cannot control every factor.
Which means this text is talking about far more than just carpentry or masonry. When it says house or city, we have to expand those definitions. We are talking about human systems.
Right.
We are talking about corporate structures, economic policies, educational institutions, and even nations.
We are talking about any endeavor where humans attempt to organize chaos into order. And the warning is stark. Of every system of thought, of every institution, unless the Lord is the underlying architect, the whole structure must sooner or later fall into hopeless ruin.
That is a heavy thought.
It is. Human hands can accomplish astonishing things temporarily. We can draft brilliant constitutions, we can watch the borders, we can invent incredible technologies, but without the sustaining providence of God, we've accomplished nothing of permanent, eternal value.
You know, there is a historical anecdote in our sources that perfectly illustrates this, and it brings this ancient text right into the modern realm of nation building. It is the story of Benjamin Franklin at the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia.
Oh, this is a fantastic example.
For context, this was a moment of supreme crisis for the newly formed United States. The initial Articles of Confederation were failing. The delegates were locked in a sweltering room, arguing bitterly over state representation, local interests, and the balance of power.
Tempers were flaring.
The whole project was on the brink of shattering. They were staring down the barrel of a fractured, vulnerable continent.
Yes. The smartest political minds of the era were in that room. They had all the human intellect, all the legal theory, all the philosophical blueprints they could ever need, and it wasn't working. They were gridlocked.
So what happened?
At that critical juncture, Benjamin Franklin, who was 81 years old and the elder statesman of the convention, stood up to address the room, and he anchored his entire argument on the exact verse we are analyzing.
Give us the quote, because the way he deployed this text in a political setting is staggering.
He looked at this room of divided, frustrated politicians and said, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?"
That gives you chills.
He went on to explicitly reference the builders of Babel, warning the delegates that without concurring divine aid, their political building would proceed no better than that ancient failure.
He warned them that their counsels would be confounded, and they themselves would become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. He recognized that all their legal genius was insufficient to hold a nation together.
And because of that deep conviction, he made a formal motion to institute daily prayers before their political deliberations.
It is a stunning historical moment. Here you have a man who was the quintessential self-made intellectual, a scientist, an inventor, a diplomat, publicly recognizing the absolute limits of human capacity. He understood that the watchmen can debate the laws all day long, but if God doesn't keep the city, the republic will fracture.
And we see this same principle playing out not just on the macro level of empires, but on the micro level of individual human hearts. Our sources bring in the writings of Madame Guyon from the 17th century.
What did she say?
She wrote extensively about learning the brutal lesson of her own dependence. She noted a distinct pattern in her life. When she actively looked to the Lord and acknowledged her dependence, her heart was defended against despair and temptation. But the moment she felt confident, the moment she relied on her own discipline or fidelity, she fell apart.
Her own strength became her weakness.
Right. Her enemies, whether external circumstances or internal anxieties, prevailed easily. She had to refuse the urge to ascribe her victories to her own efforts. The poet Phineas Fletcher captured this exact sentiment beautifully in the late 16th century. He wrote, "If God build not the house and lay the groundwork sure, whoever build, it cannot stand one stormy day. If God be not the city's shield, in vain is watchtower, men and all."
One stormy day. That is all it takes to expose a foundation built on self-reliance. So we have established that physical, structural, and systemic success requires the true master builder. But I want to pivot here. I want to ask about the psychological toll of ignoring this truth. Because if you truly believe that the survival of your family or your career or your nation rests entirely on your own shoulders, that will do something terrifying to your mind and your body.
Oh, absolutely.
What happens to us internally when we try to carry the weight of sovereignty?
Well, that psychological toll is what the text addresses next. It moves seamlessly from the external building site to the internal neurological state of the builder. Verse 2 says, "It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep."
This verse feels like it was written specifically for our modern cultural moment. We live in an era completely obsessed with hustle culture.
We really do.
We have tech CEOs and motivational speakers constantly preaching this gospel of the grind. You have to burn the midnight oil. You have to wake up at 4 a.m., jump in a cold plunge, skip meals, and sacrifice your relationships to get ahead.
It is exhausting just thinking about it.
Right. Society treats a lack of sleep and a surplus of stress as a badge of honor, proof that you are committed to the building process. But this ancient text looks at that frantic, anxiety-driven lifestyle and slaps the word vain right across it.
Charles F. Deems, one of the commentators in our source stack, provides a razor-sharp analysis of this specific behavior. He points out that work itself is not the problem. The law of work is woven into our nature. But nature has also set strict biological boundaries for our effort.
The body needs rest.
Exactly. When you look at the original Hebrew phrasing, it literally means making early to rise and making late to sit down. It describes the deliberate, artificial lengthening of the day.
Stretching the boundaries of human endurance to squeeze out a few more drops of productivity.
Yes, and Deems argues that no net result of good ever comes to the individual from this artificial prolonging of the day at either end. Waking up before your brain and body are rested, burning the scholar's midnight oil, eating a rushed breakfast by the light of a candle.
Just grinding away.
When these actions are driven by a frantic anxiety that you won't have enough or be enough, they are a complete delusion. They are a snare. You are borrowing energy from tomorrow that you will have to pay back with severe interest.
Let's talk about the phrase, the bread of sorrows. That is such a visceral image. How does a lack of faith, this intense anxiety about the future, literally change the way we experience our daily provision?
Thomas Manton, a brilliant thinker from the 1600s, breaks down the bread of sorrows perfectly. He says it is the bread of wearisome, tear-soaked effort.
Tear-soaked effort, wow.
Picture a person who has achieved some level of financial success, but they are living a life of absolute internal misery. They fret over every minor disappointment. They are eaten alive by envy when they see a competitor advance. They hoard their wealth. They eat the cheapest, most joyless food. And they systematically destroy their own physical health because they have absolutely no trust that there will be provision tomorrow.
So they have the bread, but the bread tastes like ash. They're eating a sandwich over their keyboard, staring at a spreadsheet, terrified that the market is going to crash. The anxiety ruins the provision.
Manton says they are grating on their own flesh. They are literally threatening to bring themselves into the sleep of death by neglecting the natural sleep which refreshes life. And why? Because they find no joy in the present moment. Their only perceived security is in hoarding up resources for a future they cannot control. It is a miserable existence.
But the text offers an alternative, a stark contrast to the bread of sorrows. It says, "For so he giveth his beloved sleep." I want to dive into the linguistics here because the original language reveals something breathtaking about the nature of this rest.
This is where it gets highly specific and incredibly comforting. Thomas Brooks, another 17th century writer, points out the Hebrew word for sleep used in this exact verse is shina.
Sheena.
What is unique here is the spelling. In this instance, it is written with an aleph at the end. In the Hebrew alphabet, the aleph is a quiet, resting letter. It is a breath. The inclusion of this silent letter denotes an exceptionally quiet, profound, deep rest. It is a sleep completely and utterly free from the fret and fume of daily life.
A quiet letter for a quiet rest. That is brilliant. It isn't just closing your eyes while your mind continues to race through tomorrow's to-do list.
No, it is much more than that.
It is a physiological and spiritual cessation of panic. Brooks calls it a crown set upon the head, the gold chain around the neck. It is a peace that can only come from the realization that you are not the one holding the universe together.
John Calvin also weighed in on this, and he makes a crucial distinction. He notes that this divine gift of sleep does not mean God nourishes slothfulness.
Right, going back to the laziness point.
God is not rewarding the lazy person who refuses to work. Instead, he grants a placid labor. The hands are not idle. The believer is still swinging the hammer and keeping the powder dry, but the mind reposes in the stillness of faith. The soul is at rest, as if asleep, even while the body is engaged in the day's work. Furthermore, the Hebrew phrase translated for "so he giveth" can also be rendered with just the same result, or all the same.
Explain how that changes the meaning.
It means that the person who is beloved by God can work diligently, go home, and sleep soundly, and the necessary provision will be granted all the same as if they had stayed up all night worrying about it. The anxiety adds absolutely nothing to the yield.
That is so true.
The frantic hustler and the faithful sleeper both have 24 hours, but the faithful sleeper receives the provision without the agonizing psychological tax.
Charles Spurgeon shares a highly vivid dream in his commentary that illustrates this psychological divide perfectly. He dreamt of two distinct dwellings, the castle of discontent and the cottage of content.
Describe the castle. It is a perfect metaphor for the anxious, self-reliant mind.
In the dream, the castle of discontent was an absolute fortress. It had massive, towering stone walls, a deep, dark moat, and armed watchmen pacing the battlements day and night. Spurgeon dreamt he was inside this castle, wearing heavy, clanking iron armor. He had all this wealth and status hidden deep inside the keep.
Sounds pretty secure.
You would think so. But the defining feature of the castle was that he could never, ever rest. Every few minutes, a trumpet would blast. To arms, to arms. He was constantly rushing to the top of the wall, peering into the dark, terrified that an unseen enemy was coming to steal his treasure. The drawbridge was always pulled up. Sleep simply did not exist in the castle of discontent.
And that is the paradox of self-reliance. You build these massive, impenetrable walls of wealth or status or reputation, thinking they will give you peace, but instead you become a prisoner to your own defenses. You are trapped inside the walls, constantly waiting for the alarm to sound, constantly terrified of losing what you have built.
Exactly. And then the dream shifts. He finds himself in the cottage of content. It was a simple, unprotected place. No moat, no watchman, no heavy armor.
Just a basic cottage.
Yeah. He had absolutely no worldly treasure to protect except for one single sparkling jewel resting on his chest. It was the jewel of a quiet conscience and the assurance of divine love. In the dream, he put his hand over that jewel, laid his head down, and instantly fell into a deep, unbroken sleep until the morning light. He could sleep because he was entirely satisfied with the one thing that could not be taken from him. He didn't have to play the role of the frantic, sleepless watchman.
Philip Goodwin, writing in 1658, points out how this concept of sleep as a divine gift shows up in several dramatic biblical narratives. One of the most striking is the story of the Apostle Peter in the book of Acts.
Oh, that is a great story.
Peter is in a maximum security prison.
Oh.
He is bound with heavy iron chains, sleeping literally between two armed soldiers with more guards at the door, and he is scheduled to be executed by King Herod the very next morning.
The anxiety in that scenario should be off the charts. His heart rate should be through the roof. He should be pacing the cell, eating the bread of sorrows, agonizing over his impending death.
Yet what is he doing? He is sleeping so deeply, so profoundly, that when the angel of the Lord appears in the cell to rescue him, a bright light shining in his face doesn't even wake him up.
That is wild.
The text says the angel literally had to strike Peter on the side to rouse him. That is the Sheena with the quiet Aleph. That is the sleep of the beloved. He was able to rest because he had completely handed over the outcome of his life to the master builder.
You see the exact same peace with Jesus during the violent storm on the Sea of Galilee. The text describes a severe squall. The boat is being swamped. Experienced fishermen are screaming in panic, bailing water, convinced they are going to drown.
They thought it was over.
And where is Jesus? He's asleep on a cushion in the stern. The roaring wind and the crashing waves literally rocked him to sleep because his internal reality was anchored in his Father's sovereignty. He was entirely insulated from the hurly-burly of the external storm.
Christopher Wordsworth, another scholar in our material, draws an incredible theological parallel regarding sleep. He goes all the way back to Genesis, to the Garden of Eden. When God decides to build a bride for Adam, what does he do? He doesn't ask Adam to help him design Eve. He puts Adam into a deep, supernatural sleep.
Right.
And while Adam is completely unconscious, completely inactive, God takes a rib from his side and builds the woman.
So the greatest blessing of Adam's life was constructed while he was entirely oblivious and at rest.
Precisely. And Wordsworth draws a straight line from that event to Christ, the second Adam. Christ slept the sleep of death on the cross, and through that ultimate sleep, the spiritual temple of the church, his bride, was formed. It is a recurring pattern. God often executes his most intricate building work while his people are resting. It completely shatters the illusion that our frantic anxiety is required for God to accomplish his purposes.
And speaking of the sleep of death, Henry Melville takes this entire concept to its logical conclusion. He views this gift of sleep as a direct metaphor for death itself. For the person who trusts the master builder, even the final, terrifying dissolution of the physical body is not a defeat.
It changes the whole paradigm.
It is not something to be feared. It is simply a gentle gift of rest from a sovereign God.
Melville argues that if we understand sleep as God's gift to his beloved, it radically alters how we view our final hours on earth. The physical sickness leading up to death may be distressing, the pain may be real, but the parting moment itself is not a violent tearing away. Melville pictures angels waiting to take charge of the soul, and a hand gentler than any human hand closing the eyes, whispering the ancient promise, "He giveth his beloved sleep."
It entirely removes the sting. It changes our understanding of rest from a mere biological necessity, recharging the battery so we can grind harder tomorrow, into a deep theological comfort. When you truly let go of your anxiety, your daily routine changes. You can take a fair measure of rest. You can eat a decent meal, knowing it is for your health, without feeling that crushing guilt that you should be doing more or the terror that tomorrow won't have enough.
So we have looked at the futility of building physical houses without God, and we have examined the internal psychological toll of refusing to rest. But the text doesn't stop there. It pivots sharply. It moves from these external structures and internal anxieties to the concept of building something far more lasting, far more complex. A family legacy.
Yes, this is where the text shifts focus entirely to the future. Verse 3 says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward." I want to point out a brilliant linguistic connection here from the commentator Adam Clarke, because it ties the entire text together. We started with building a house. In Hebrew, the root word for to build is bana. That exact same root word is the foundation for the Hebrew word ben, meaning son, and bath, meaning daughter.
That is a crucial cultural insight. To the ancient Hebrew mind, building a house did not primarily mean stacking stones and raising cedar beams. It literally meant building a lineage. Sons and daughters are the living stones that construct a family's true house.
That makes so much sense.
You can build the most magnificent physical palace on earth, but without descendants, what is the purpose of accumulating all that wealth?
The house is empty.
Exactly. The text asks, what boots it that a man is the possessor of broad acres, of massive estates, if he has no heir to leave them to? Think of Napoleon Bonaparte. With all his military genius, his unyielding ambition, and his conquest of Europe, he could not successfully create a lasting dynasty on his own power. Our sources note that hundreds of incredibly wealthy individuals would gladly give up half their estates just to hear the cry of a child in their quiet halls. Building a legacy, the true house, is entirely dependent on the Lord's provision.
And this specific portion of the text aggressively challenges our modern Western cultural narratives. Today's society often views children through a purely economic lens.
We really do.
They are seen as financial burdens. Our sources even use the older term encumbrances. We look at inflation, the cost of a college education, the need for larger houses and bigger cars, the loss of personal free time, and we calculate that raising a human being is a massive liability.
How does this ancient text respond to that hyper-calculated mindset? It completely and totally inverts it. H.T. Armfield notes that the Hebrew phrasing implies that children are an inheritance belonging to the Lord. They are his property, which he graciously entrusts to parents as stewards. They are given as a reward, a token for good, not as a penalty or a financial punishment. Armfield argues that in a rightly ordered society, children are received with gratitude, never with regret.
But the anxiety of provision is real. A young couple looks at their bank account and thinks, we literally cannot afford another mouth to feed. Adam Clarke addresses this anxiety head-on in the commentary. He quotes a very blunt Arab proverb, "Wherever God sends mouths, he sends meat."
The underlying theology of that proverb is that the Creator who provides the heritage will also provide the necessary sustenance to maintain that heritage. If he gives the gift, he supplies the means to sustain it. There's a beautiful historical quote in our materials from Dr. Guthrie, a minister who had 11 children.
11 children, what?
Now, modern financial planners would look at 11 children and see nothing but an insurmountable mountain of debt and immense financial strain. But Dr. Guthrie's perspective was totally different. He famously said, "I am rich and nothing but children." He viewed them as actual wealth.
There is a similar story about the Reverend Moses Brown, who had 12 children. Someone made a somewhat snide remark to him, saying, "Sir, you have just as many children as the patriarch Jacob." And Brown fired back, "Yes, and I have Jacob's God to provide for them."
That is a great response.
It is a total refusal to adopt the world's scarcity mindset.
Bishop Joseph Hall, writing in the late 1500s, made a very sharp, almost stinging observation about this dynamic. He said he noticed that no one is so gripple and hard-fisted, which is an old way of saying stingy and hoarding, as the childless person who only has themselves to care for. Whereas those who are forced to manage large families continually experience the daily providence of God in their affairs. Because they have to rely on God, they often lay out what they receive with much more cheerfulness and generosity. Hall asks a rhetorical question. He that feedeth the young raisins, can he fail the best of his creatures?
It requires a massive shift in perspective, recognizing that human lives are a better, more secure treasure than dead gold or silver locked in a vault. The commentator Joseph Carroll points out that while houses and lands are indeed inherited from the Lord, children are more of God than mere property. You can buy land with money. You cannot buy a soul. They are living, breathing treasures.
Which leads directly into the most famous metaphor in this entire passage, found in verse 4. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth.
I have to play devil's advocate here, because calling children arrows sounds incredibly militaristic to modern ears.
Oh, it definitely does.
It sounds like the text is saying, we should just breed little soldiers for cultural warfare. Modern parents want to nurture their kids, protect them, and give them a safe environment. We don't naturally think of our toddlers as ballistics. How do we reconcile that imagery?
It is a phenomenal question, and George Swinnock gives the absolute best explanation of this metaphor. He asks us to think about the nature of an arrow. An arrow does not naturally grow on a tree. If you go into the woods and pick up a stick, it is not an arrow.
No, it's just a stick.
Right. By nature, it is knotty, rugged, crooked, and covered in bark. If you try to shoot a raw stick from a bow, it will fly erratically and fail completely.
So the raw material requires intense intervention.
Exactly. The stick must be crafted into an arrow by immense art and grueling effort. It has to be stripped, sanded, straightened through heat, and carefully balanced with fletching. Swinnock argues that human beings, by nature, are like that rugged stick. We are born untoward, crooked, and prone to selfish chaos. The parent's grueling duty is the craftsmanship of the arrow. It is the agonizing work of shaping, smoothing, instructing, and disciplining the child so they become pliable to the divine will and capable of flying straight.
And timing is everything. You have to have the arrows in your hand while they're still malleable. If you wait until the stick is old, thick, and hardened to try and bend it straight, it will snap. You have to train them early while the wood is still green.
And here is the most beautiful part of the arrow metaphor. Think about the function of the weapon. A sword is used for close combat. It stays in the warrior's hand. But an arrow is designed to fly where the warrior cannot possibly reach. The parent pulls the bow back, aims carefully, and lets go. Good children are shot into the future, carrying the values, the faith, and the legacy of the family into a time and place the parents will never live to see. The warrior stays behind. The arrow goes forward to hit the mark.
That completely changes the militaristic feel of the verse. It is about extending influence beyond your own lifespan. There's a fascinating quote in our sources from James Merrick, who cites an old Chinese proverb from Dahalde. The proverb says, when a son is born into a family, a bow and arrow are hung before the gate. It is a symbolic expression signifying that a new protector, a new force for the family's legacy, has been added to the world.
And the text specifies children of the youth. These are children born early in a parent's life. Commentators like Joseph Addison, Alexander, and William Swan Plumer point out that this is an encouragement for the early establishment of a family. Why? Because an arrow fashioned in your youth becomes a weapon of defense in your old age. When your own physical strength fades, when you can no longer draw the bow yourself, the children you raised in your vigor become your strength and support in your declining years.
The passage concludes with verse 5. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. Now, a quiver full is a famous phrase, and it acknowledges reality. A large number of arrows means a heavy quiver. It means a large number of trials, expenses, and sleepless nights. But when managed by faith, it also yields a mass of love and a multitude of joys.
We do need to offer a point of clarification here, as the commentators do. While those with a full quiver are objectively blessed, a quiet life may not require such a massive arsenal. A quiver may be physically small, holding only 1 or 2 arrows, and yet be completely full according to God's design. The blessing is not found in hitting a specific numerical quota. The blessing is obtained in the provision God decides is best for that specific family. The ultimate truth is that a person's life does not consist in the abundance of what they possess, but in the divine favor resting upon whatever they have been given.
Let's unpack that final phrase, speaking with the enemies in the gate. To understand this, we have to understand the architecture and sociology of an ancient Near Eastern city. The gate was not just a door and a wall, it was the absolute center of civic life.
William Nicholson and Daniel Cresswell elaborate on this brilliantly. The gate served two primary functions. First, militarily, it was the choke point. If an enemy army laid siege to the city, they would bring their battering rams to the gate. The defense had to hold there. If a father had a large clan of brave, loyal, well-trained sons, he had built-in defenders. Marauders and enemies think twice before meddling with a man who has a small, fiercely loyal army standing around him.
And the second function was judicial.
Yes. The gate was the local courthouse. It was where the elders sat, where contracts were signed, and where legal disputes were tried. If a man was falsely accused, or if he had a cause pending in the gate against a malicious neighbor, his children would stand up for him. They were his advocates, his witnesses, his character references. He would not suffer injustice for lack of a bold defense.
Our sources quote a passage from Sophocles' ancient Greek tragedy, Antigone, which proves how universal this human sentiment really is. The quote says, "This is the pride, the glory of a man, to train obedient children in his house, prompt on his enemies to avenge his wrongs, and with the father's zeal and honor high to hold his friends. It is about having your own voice amplified, having your words made emphatic by the resolve and the character of the people you have raised."
And we can, and absolutely should, extend this metaphor beyond biological families. The text and the commentators apply this directly to spiritual children as well. Think about a teacher, a mentor, or a pastor. The people they disciple, the converts they guide, the students whose minds they shape, these are also a quiver full of arrows. They are the heritage of the Lord and the reward of the mentor's soul travail.
So a teacher without biological children can still have a completely full quiver.
Exactly. By these spiritual children, the city of the church and the fabric of society are built up and defended. When critics attack the truth, the mentor doesn't always have to argue back directly. They can point to the changed lives of their spiritual arrows. The arrows answer the opponents by flying straight and true in the public square.
So, bringing all three of these major themes together, we started our deep dive on the outside, looking at the macro level. We looked at the physical city, the skyscraper, the nation state, and the absolute futility of working without divine blessing. We saw that whether you are Solomon building the temple or Benjamin Franklin drafting a constitution, relying on your own intellect is just building a taller Tower of Babel.
Then we moved inward, examining the micro level, the psychological toll of that self-reliance. We contrasted the exhausting modern hustle culture and the bitter taste of the bread of sorrows with the physiological and spiritual gift of sleep. We learned that the quiet Aleph in the word Shina represents a total cessation of anxiety for the beloved of God.
And finally, we looked forward. We moved from the present rest to the future legacy, seeing how that same divine blessing shapes the next generation. We learned that shaping human lives, whether they are your biological kids or your spiritual mentees, is the single greatest, most difficult building project you will ever undertake. And it requires agonizing craftsmanship to turn raw sticks into straight arrows, aiming them toward a future mark you will never see.
The defining factor across all three of these arenas, the city, the soul, and the family, is trust. You cannot be passive. You must labor on the scaffolding. You must stand watch in the dark. You must painstakingly craft the arrows. But you must hold the deep, quiet conviction that the efficacy of all your sweat and tears depends entirely on the operational providence of the master builder.
If the most strenuous human efforts yield absolutely nothing without divine blessing, and if our greatest, longest-lasting legacy is the lives we shape under that same blessing, there is a hard question we have to confront before we close. Look at your own life right now. What specific anxiety are you clutching with a white-knuckle grip? What project, what relationship, what financial fear are you frantically guarding inside your own castle of discontent?
Identify it and then hand the blueprint back to the architect who actually holds the universe together. You do not have to pace the walls tonight.
Think back to that skyscraper we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
You might not have the math perfectly figured out. The landscape of your life, your career, or your family might look incredibly messy, chaotic, and uncertain. But if you stop relying on your own strength, you can step away from the site, you can put the hammer down, you can go home, and you can literally sleep on it tonight.